One of my favorite comedians is named Norm Macdonald. We know that there's many different opinions about him.
I love him. He has just a voice.
So he was once on a talk show, and he said, he asked someone else who was on this show, he said, have you heard of this Adolf Hitler fellow? They said, yeah, I've heard of him. He said, the more I hear about him, the less I care for him, or the more I don't care for him. The more I hear about him, the more I don't care for him. Right? Which was quite a funny thing to say. And that is directly related to what we are going to learn this evening. How might not be immediately clear, but we'll get to it. Last week, in last week's episode, we were discussing that God is infinitely above Chachma, is infinitely above wisdom. God transcends wisdom. Wisdom cannot grasp him. But in fact, we gave a metaphor for the extent to which God is above wisdom. We said that as high as wisdom is above action, or as far as wisdom is from action, so too is God from wisdom. As far as wisdom is from action, God is from wisdom, right? We sum this up with the line, Kulam b'chachma asisa, which means you have performed, or you have done them all with chachma. Because to him, chachma, wisdom, is like an action. It is as far from him as action is from wisdom, right? That was our metaphor. We said, we elaborated, we gave an example of I believe it was putting one coin in tzedakah versus the reality of love, the concept, right? That's how far action is from wisdom, and God is that far himself above wisdom, yet again. And in truth, we said that the metaphor is really insufficient. The Alter Rebbe says, because action is only 5 yesh me'ayins. It's only 5 unbridgeable gaps, right, from wisdom. We said that action is not in the same realm as speech, which is not in the same realm as thought, which is not in the same realm as emotion, which is not in the same realm as chachma, as wisdom, as intellect, right? So action, is separated from wisdom by 5, so to speak, insurmountable gaps. There are 5 dimensions, 5 realms apart, 5 yesh ma'ayins, 5 ex nihilos, unbridgeable gaps apart from each other. But God, to wisdom, is actually many, many, many more than 5. Which leaves us with the question, so why is this the metaphor? Right? In other words, if the metaphor of the distance between action and wisdom does not tell us how far God is above wisdom, then why even use the metaphor?
Because there's not a better one.
There's actually 2 answers. One answer is there's not a better one. And the second one we'll get more into this week, where we explain how there actually is something important captured in this metaphor, even though it's insufficient. So number 1, there is no better metaphor. Why is there no better metaphor? Because in our experience, in human experience, nothing is more distant than wisdom is to action. That's the furthest we can go. That's what's within our experience. So therefore, this is technically the best metaphor we can give, even if it's insufficient, right? And in fact, to what extent is it insufficient? The Alter Rebbe began to explain. We said that not only the way to understand God's distance from wisdom is that not only is he beyond comprehension, but in fact, the extent to which he is beyond comprehension, we cannot understand. Not only can we not understand him, we cannot understand how far he is beyond our understanding. A different way of putting this is that not only don't we know him, we don't know how much we don't know. A third way of putting it is that to say we don't know him is actually to lower him down. It is actually to bring him closer to us than he is. Certainly we don't know him. But to say that you don't know him, right, implies that he is within the realm of the known quantity, right? Right? He is beyond our grasp, but he is at least graspable in theory, right?
That's
so to speak.
If we were only a little
Correct,
smarter,
yes.
if we were only a little smarter,
Right.
we could have grasped it.
If we were more intelligent, we would understand him, right? Comes the Alter Rebbe and says that whole implication is really to bring God down. That's bringing God within the realm of Chachma. To say you don't understand him means he is essentially within the realm of wisdom. True, not grasped by wisdom in the affirmative sense, but he is at least within that realm such that you can negate him from wisdom. You can say, I don't understand him. Right? God, in fact, in actuality, is beyond being understood and not being understood. Yes, this is still review. We're still doing review. It's for the phone. A good metaphor, which I actually said I was going to mention last week and didn't end up mentioning, it slipped my mind. A good metaphor for this idea is the idea of color. I can't remember if I've mentioned it in this class before. If I have, it was a long time ago. The idea of color. Color is the metaphor, right? There's only a certain number of colors that the human eye can see and that we know. In fact, I think that scientifically speaking, there's a limit to the amount of colors that are possible, right? Because it's spectrums of light, so to speak, and beyond, above and below a certain wavelength, it becomes invisible, right? So visible light, so to speak, is a defined geder. There's an upper limit and a lower limit, and we basically know everything in between, right? Even if no one has ever found every single fractional shade of magenta, right?
That depends if you're a man or a woman.
We know that magenta. We know that whatever's between one shade, dark purple and light purple, is not something beyond knowledge, if you understand what I mean. There's no other colors in there. It's all shades of purple, right? It's all within that. It's a spectrum. We know the bounds of the spectrum. It's a known quantity, essentially. The number of colors that exist, the number of colors we can see, etc. So, God is the source of color, right? So there's different ways to speak about God. The most limiting way to speak about God, good evening, hello.
May I disturb you? Already have.
Oh, thank you very much.
For the body as long as food.
That's a good disturbance. That's a good disturbance. Thank you very much. Amen. Thank you very much. So there's different ways when you talk about.
Good?
Well, there's different ways when you talk about color, right? You have colors, which is a limited quantity, right? There's limited numbers. It's a known factor. It's a known spectrum. And you have God, who we know, where is the source of the colors? The colors come from God, right? So there's different ways of relating the color to God. For our purposes, 3 ways, right? Number 1 is to say that the only colors that God has, the only things that God has are the things that we know, right? In other words, we have however many it is, 32 million colors, or however many it is that we can perceive different shades, and God has 32 million colors. In other words, everything that he is, he has created and put into the world, right? That's how many colors he has. In truth, this would be deeply mistaken, because that's not what God means. That's not what the word God means, right? God is the source of many, many other things. God is infinite in a way that nothing physical or nothing perceived by us can be, etc., etc. So you want to say, a religious person would want to say, that no, God has an infinite number of colors, right? This is an inexact metaphor, but this is a very, very roughly, right? right? God has an infinite number of colors. In other words, we stop at 32 million, he could keep going to 100 million, 150 million, right? What's stopping him? Right? He can find all new ways to make colors. He's not limited to the physics of the spectrum of electromagnetic radiation as we know it. He's infinite, right? He's of infinite potential. The colors that are in our world are the colors that he decided to put in, but fundamentally, God is not limited in his knowledge of colors, right? So you have God is finite, which is clearly wrong, right? Then we say God is infinite and unknowable. But what's the key here? What's the key? The key is we are saying he is unknowable in a known way. In other words, I know 32 million colors, and I'm saying he's bigger than that. He has more colors than that. Which the more I say, the more colors he has, the greater God is to me, the further away from physical existence I place him, right? The more colors he can create, the more his infinite ability, right, in relation to the things that exist, the more beyond he is, right? So that's not knowing God. I don't know God, and I know the way in which I don't know him, right? I know the way in which he is beyond the world, because where I only have 32 million colors, he has 33 million or 100 million. He's more. The truth is, the way the Alter Rebbe is saying, is that God doesn't just have an infinite number of colors. God has an infinite number of infinite things, right? He doesn't just have the things we know about extended to the infinite. That means he's within the realms of wisdom. He has an infinite number of things. He has an infinite number of varieties of an infinite number of things that we don't know about, right? Now that does not provide us with any knowledge, right? In other words, I can say, if I take everything, right, color was just one limited example, but I could take every type of thing, if I cataloged everything in the universe and the entire human experience, and I say God has infinite numbers of these things, that still would not capture him, right? Which is exactly what the Alter Rebbe is saying. The Alter Rebbe is saying the highest form of human experience is Chachma. If you take all the Chachma, right, you would not really appreciate how infinite God is and how great God is. Instead, he is great in ways that don't even enter into your equation and that can't possibly enter into your equation because they weren't put into your universe. They weren't put into your reality, your experience. He isn't just above Chachma, right? He is so high above Chachma, he is so far above our experience that for all we know, and in fact, he has an infinite number of things that we have. In fact, it's taught in the Kabbalah that the 10 spheres, the 10 modes of divine expression, right, which God uses to create our entire universe, right, starting from the Torah on down, right, we start Chachma is the highest thing, the divine wisdom, so to speak. These 10 modes of divine expression are 10 chosen from an infinite number. In other words, it's not just that our universe as it is limited relative to God. It's that our universe in its DNA, even in the 10 modes of divine expression that God uses to create it, those are 10 chosen from infinity. What's the 11th one? Not only do we not know, we can't possibly know. We can't possibly know. It wasn't even put into the blueprint of the world. It wasn't even put into the Torah, the other spheres that he chose the 10 from. Sorry? It's totally beyond our comprehension, right? This is what we are saying when we say God is beyond even not knowing, and to say that we don't know him is in fact to bring him down, to lower him down to within, as if he is within the realm of understanding. We just haven't reached him yet, as Ronnie said, right? If I knew just a little bit more, I would know God, and that is incorrect. Let us now continue in the chapter of Tanya. We are going to page.
Considering having another one. Where do we start?
We are on the Ha'omer,
That's a good one. Looks like it is.
I believe. Did we make it that far last week? 954. We're on V'ha'emer. I think that's where we waited up to last week.
953 here.
Are you sure? You made a mark where we got up to last week. Okay. We'll start there. Fine. Bottom of 953. Ki inyan ha'asaga, says the Holy Alter Rebbe. Ki inyan ha'asaga mitzyaches v'neifel al davar v'chachma v'seichel. Comprehension pertains and applies only to a matter of wisdom or intellect. To say that it is possible to understand him or impossible to understand him because of the depth of the concept, right? When I say I don't understand something, it means it's understandable in theory, but I don't have enough wisdom to understand it. Top of 954. But the Holy One, blessed be He, who is above intellect and understanding, you cannot say about Him that it is impossible to understand Him because of the depth of His understanding. He's actually not just beyond our understanding, we're explaining the way in which He's beyond the depth of our understanding, right? To say we can't understand Him is in fact the wrong thing to say. It brings Him down to within the realm of intellect. We are actually saying more than that we can't understand Him. Because He is not within the realm of comprehension at all.
So you're just saying, it's not, is that we're incapable of understanding God.
Correct.
That's the summary.
Yes.
No one is capable, yeah, I would say. I would go even further. Intellect itself, I think, would be the clearest way, is incapable of understanding God, is what the Alter Rebbe is aiming at. All intellect, as we're going to discuss, all intellect is incapable of understanding God. Absolutely. Not just that He is technically not understood, right, but we're incapable, exactly. Third line on 954. Now, the Alter Rebbe here brings a very interesting metaphor, which we mentioned last week very briefly, but now we're going to read it inside. The one who says about him, that it is impossible to understand him. If you say about God, I can't understand God, or it's impossible to understand God, is like someone who says about some lofty and deep idea, that it is impossible to touch it with your hands due to the depth of the idea. That's the metaphor. If you say, I can't understand God, it's like saying, this idea is so deep that I can't touch it with my hands. Right? So we see here the elements that we're working with in this chapter. I just want to point out the structure of what the Alter Rebbe is saying, right? Within the human perspective, which is the metaphor here, right? The touching idea with the idea with your hands, right? We know chachma, which is an idea, generally, right? Very generally speaking, an idea, an intellect, an aspect, an idea that we have. So you have chachma, and then you have the actual motions of your hands, which is asiyah, which is action. Right? And we know that these things are so far one from the other that not only can you not touch an idea, but the reason you can't touch an idea has nothing to do with the fact that the idea is a deep, a profound, or a shallow idea. Right? That's not the point. So too, now, in the nimshal, when we leave the human metaphor and we talk about God, God has the same relationship to chachma itself. So it becomes, the lower thing becomes understanding, and the higher thing becomes God. You understand? By the human being, the lower thing is touching, and the higher thing is understanding. By God, the lower thing is understanding. The higher thing is God. And to say that you cannot understand God is basically saying that He is within the realm of understanding. Right? Just like to say, I can't touch the idea implies that the idea is within the realm of touching. Right? The reason you can't understand God is not because He's a very deep idea, it's because He's not an idea at all. And therefore, since he is not an idea, it makes no sense to say, I don't understand him. How could you understand something that is not an idea? It's like saying, it's like saying the idea is beyond my touch, because it's a very abstract concept, right? The reason I can't touch multivariable calculus is because it's too difficult, but arithmetic I can touch, right? Ridiculous, right? It's not within the same realm, right? And the Alter Rebbe continues, he says something very interesting. The Alter Rebbe says, Shekol hashemeya yitzachik loy. Anyone who hears will laugh if they heard someone say this, that the idea is so deep I can't touch it with my hands. Because the sense of touch is only related to physical action. Nitpesat, thank you, beyadayim, which is grasped in the hands. In other words, let's flesh out the metaphor. Let's flesh out the example. Right? You can touch. What's something you can touch? You can touch a pebble, right? A stone. I can hold a stone in my hand. I can touch it. But there are physical things that you cannot touch. For example, a voice, a sound. Fire is an example given in Chassidus. Fire you cannot touch, right? These are clearly physical things, right? If there's no air, you put out the fire. Also, the voice can't carry, right? In other words, these things are clearly physical. They depend on the physical, right? If, God forbid, something is wrong with your physical ear, God forbid, or even if something is in your physical ear, right? If you have earplugs in, the voice cannot penetrate it, right? It's not, earplugs can't stop an idea from penetrating because it's spiritual, right? It doesn't make any sense, right? The reason a physical, the truth is that itself is more complicated, but we're not going to get into that. As usual, everything's a little bit more complicated than it first seems, because, of course, to think ideas, you need a functioning brain, at least to think them in a physical body. But the truth is that ideas and intellect transcend even the physical body, and that things without bodies also think. We'll get to all that later, God willing. Anyway, it was just a footnote. So you have something which is physical and you can touch it, like a rock, and you have something physical which you can't touch, like fire or a sound, right? Physical, but you can't touch it. Why not? Because, in the words of the Alter Rebbe, you cannot touch it because it is higher and more edel, as we would say in Yiddish, more dak b'lashon kodesh. It's more refined, right? In other words, it's not as limited by time and space, so to speak. It's not so material that you can touch it, right? It's a little bit higher. It's a tefach hecher. It's raised a little bit higher than the most physical realm. So it's physical, but you can't touch it, right? Then
that's the second reason, actually, that you're bringing.
What is?
Why use this parable? To say that it's exactly not that. It's not like a more, you can relate to God as something.
Yeah, generally, no, well, in thought, we're going to understand, right? So if you take the Pythagorean theorem, another one of my favorite examples in this class, if you take the Pythagorean theorem, right, it's not physical. It's not how, but the question is, how not physical is it, right? You could say fire is not physical because I can't touch it. But the thing is that you can't touch it is a comment on not whether it's within the realm of touch. It's within the realm, it's physical. But on how edel it is, how material it is, right? How tangible it is. It's a little bit less tangible, a little bit less material. When you say, I can't touch the Pythagorean theorem, it's not like that, right? And what's the proof? Because the same way you can't touch the Pythagorean theorem is the same way that you can't touch an idea in the Talmud, lahavdil. Or you can't touch some stupid idea you read on Facebook, right, from your neighbor who always argues with you, right, for example. So you can't touch that idea either. In other words, the not touching of the idea it doesn't depend at all on how refined or how coarse, how material and low, or how deep and high the idea is. Why? Obviously, because the idea is simply in a different dimension. It's a different gedder. It's a whole different universe, right? Touch and ideas are not things that go together. It's a simple mismatch, right? There's no intersection between the two things. So too, when you talk about God, right? God is exactly the same in comparison to ideas, right? In comparison to thinking. To say I can't understand God, right, implies that there are some ideas which are more coarse, which I can understand, right? Then there are some ideas which are more refined, which are more edel, right, which my mind can't happen to grasp. But they're still in the realm of understanding, right? God and the mind don't intersect, not because God is more refined or too deep to understand. They don't intersect because he is not a being of intellect. He's not a mental phenomenon, right?
So you can understand why you cannot touch a sound, but you cannot understand why you cannot grasp God. Even though they're not related.
With intellect, not touch. You mean understand, not touch.
No, you cannot touch. You're not able to feel something spiritual, but you can understand why you cannot touch this thing. But you cannot understand why you cannot touch God, for instance.
I think that's a different point than what the Alter Rebbe is making. I don't think that's what the Alter Rebbe is saying. Okay. I think that may also be true, but I don't think that's what the Alter Rebbe is saying. Because the Alter Rebbe is making a very specific comparison. He's comparing Hashem to Chachma, right? The point is that the ideas are to God as touching is to ideas for us, right? That he's making that specific comparison. That's the comparison he wants to make. Okay. Because the whole chapter in context is going to be about Chachma. You'll see, it's all about intellect. We're going to get there. So the point is, we are establishing that God is not within the realm of intellect. Not he's an intellect, he's an idea which is too difficult for anyone to understand. He is not an idea. Emphatically, he is not a mental phenomenon. Just as an idea is not a physical phenomenon, God is not a mental phenomenon. He is not an idea. So when we are still saying we can't understand him, right? We're being very precise. It's not just that we can't understand God, right? It's that we cannot understand him in any way which adds to our understanding. Again, some forms of not understanding add to our actual understanding or add to our grasp, right? If I tell you that fire is something which your hands can't grasp, you know that fire is a physical phenomenon, and it's very refined. In other words, by negating what's called yedias hashlila, negative knowledge, apophatic theology in the technical term, right? When you're saying we know what God isn't, right? The whole purpose of saying we know what God isn't is to add to our to the depth of our appreciation of how far beyond us he is. Think back to the colors. Right? Think back to the colors. When I say God is not limited to worldly colors, that statement adds to my appreciation of God. I am saying that I don't understand him, which is true. I don't understand what colors God has other than the colors in the world. However, knowing that he has more colors itself helps me appreciate how far beyond me God is. We are saying that God himself is not at that level. God is at the further level, where he doesn't just have infinite colors, he has infinite things we don't know about. In other words, it's not just that we don't know him, it's that the way we don't know him adds nothing to our understanding of him. The Alter Rebbe, in other words, like this. The Alter Rebbe is being very precise and saying that just as Yedias HaChiyuv, just as what's called affirmative knowledge doesn't actually tell us anything about God himself, negative knowledge also doesn't tell us anything about God himself. Not only does what we know affirmatively, all the things we know, not capture God, so too does what we don't know. What we don't know also doesn't capture God. That's what he is saying. And to say that God is therefore something that we don't know is to bring God down, is an insult to God. And in fact, it should make us laugh. If we understood it as well as we understood the difference between an idea and a physical object, it would make us laugh if we heard it. That's what the Alter Rebbe is saying. A different way of putting this is that even though it's true that we can't understand God, that is not the best or most accurate way of describing him. To say I don't understand him doesn't capture the situation fully, right? We normally use that term. In other words, when we use that term, because we haven't thought about it fully, when we say we don't know something, we generally think we mean pure ignorance. Think of it like this. Think of it like this. You have knowledge and you have pure ignorance, right? Not only do I not know, I don't know what I don't know. Pure ignorance. And you have knowledge, I actually know something. We normally, the reason why this is a tricky sugya, the reason why this is a tricky piece of Chassidus here, is because we normally think that this is like a digital switch. This is on or off. Either I know or I don't know. But the truth is that in Yiddishkeit, philosophically, in the history of Judaism, if you go and read, for example, the Moreh Nevuchim of the Rambam, the Guide for the Perplexed, the Rambam is very interested in the idea of Yedias HaShlila, negative knowledge of God. Negative knowledge is neither of these two things. It's not perfect ignorance, because you still know something,
Right.
which is the tricky part. And it's not obviously positive knowledge that I actually recognize this thing. It's somewhere in between. It's somewhere in between. Although I can't say that I know God, I at least know what I don't know. So I'm not ignorant. And in fact, you could categorize Yedias HaShlila as a higher ignorance, right? As a better ignorance than perfect ignorance. Rav Sadia Gaon, precursor to the Rambam, whom the Rambam is in some ways in Moreh Nevuchim in a debate in some ways. But Rav Sadia Gaon said about God, Tachlis hayedia shaloi neda'acha, which means the highest form of knowledge is that I should not know you. The highest form of knowledge is not knowing, which is also very famously associated, lahavdil, with Socrates, the founder of Western philosophy. The idea, the highest form of knowledge is knowing what you do not know. Would the Alter Rebbe agree or disagree?
Disagree.
No, agree.
Agree. I disagree.
Because at that point, you would have a comprehension
Yeah.
of the limits of your knowledge.
Right. Right. So it's the highest form of knowledge.
Well,
I mean, in other words, philosophically speaking, you could go into all the details about how this understanding of your own ignorance is really the understanding of what your own mind is, and that's why it's really the deepest form of knowledge, etc., etc. You could go on, and the highest form of knowing God is knowing that you don't know Him, which means, what does that mean, that I know I don't know Him? It means that I've negated all other possibilities, right? I've asked, is God this? Is God this? Is God this? And I go through more and more refined options, and at the end I conclude, God is none of these things. That's the way you're supposed to do it practically, and not knowing. When Rav Saadia Gaon says the highest form of knowledge of God is not knowing, that's what he means. He means that, if you ask, in other words, put it a different way, if you ask a 5-year-old school child what is God, and they say, I don't know, and you ask Rav Saadia Gaon what is God, and he says, I don't know, it's not the same I don't know, right? The 5-year-old child doesn't know because they haven't learned anything. Rav Saadia Gaon doesn't know because he's learned everything there is to know, and he knows that God is not within that boundary, right? It's a higher ignorance, the highest form of knowledge. Because why is it higher even than affirmative knowledge itself? For obvious reasons. Because Rav Saadia Gaon knows, let's say, 100% of things. Right? So God would be limited to being within the 100%.
When he's not there.
And so when you recognize that God is not within here, even though I don't get, there's no 101 or 102 because it's beyond the realm of knowledge, right? It's a tricky thing. There is nothing more, so to speak, outside of this boundary. All I know is that God is not within this boundary.
But you still know that there is God. So you know
in other words, no. Knowing that there is a God is within the boundary. Knowing what God is outside of the boundary. Right? It's a distinction. So even though my knowledge is 100, and there is no 101, right? I don't know more than what I know. I only know the positive. So what does the negative knowledge allow me to do? The Yedias HaShlila, it allows me to turn that inside out, so to speak. It allows me to say that there is a negative space around my knowledge in which God must be. I don't know what it is. I don't know its nature, but I've negated it from this area. In other words, even though you can't really extend your knowledge beyond this boundary, you can at least look out of it. You at least have a sense of how small that boundary may be. And the greater a sense you get, the bigger your boundary, the smaller it feels. Right? Counterintuitively. The more things I have negated from God, the more things I've encountered and said, that's not God, that's not God, that's not God, right? The bigger my appreciation, the bigger my wonder and astonishment of how great God is. Because look how far I've come, and He isn't any closer. I still don't have Him. Right? So even though I can't know more than what I know, and I'm saying I don't know God, I at least, my not knowing God affects how I look at what I know. That's Yedias HaShlila. Right? This is how you become humble before God, to sense how far God is above you, right? That is how a person becomes humble before God. And the more you work on Yedias HaShlila, the more humble you would become, right? So in other words, even though I can't actually say I know God Himself, it literally affects my Avodas Hashem. It's a useful thing to do. It helps me be a good Jew. It helps me worship God as He deserves, to negate more and more things from Him, because it makes me look at my own knowledge and at God differently. God gets higher, and my own knowledge gets lower, relatively speaking, right? So even though it's a way of not knowing God, even though Saadia Gaon answers, I don't know God, the same way as the child, his way of not knowing God is actually a deeper relationship with God than saying, I do know God. Because saying I do know God puts him in a box. Saying I don't know God puts me in a box. So it is actually a deeper way of relating to God, which is why Tachlis HaYidiyah Shalei Nedacha, the highest form of knowledge is to not know. Comes and says the Alter Rebbe, that's all before the Alter Rebbe. That's knowledge, perfect ignorance, and Yedias HaShlila, negative knowledge, which is in the middle. Comes the Alter Rebbe and he says that God is actually beyond both of these things. God is beyond, he's certainly beyond knowledge, that's for sure. And he is even beyond negative knowledge. So there is actually a third I don't know. Right? There's a third I don't know. The first I don't know is perfect ignorance, haven't learned anything. The second I don't know is an I don't know you come to after a life of learning things and realizing that God is outside that boundary. The third I don't know is to say that this entire pursuit does not intersect with God at all. This entire pursuit of adding knowledge, right, and even knowing what I don't know has nothing to do with God. Why should I assume that God is within the same realm as the knowable, right? Even Saadia Gaon's project starts at some level, maybe the Alter Rebbe would argue perhaps, starts at some level with the assumption that God is within the realm of intellect. He is something that cannot be known. The Alter Rebbe is saying the whole cannot be known, right? That the action of not knowing can somehow apply to him. The Alter Rebbe is saying that not knowing applies to him like not touching applies to the Pythagorean theorem. In other words, which is what is the relationship? Technically true but trivial, right? Technically true but trivial. It's technically true that you can't touch the Pythagorean theorem, but you can't touch 1 + 1 = 2 either. You can't touch multivariable calculus either. You can't touch an idea from the Gemara either, lahavdil, right? In other words, you're not touching them has nothing to do with the quality of the idea. You're not learning, in other words, when Rav Saadia Gaon is learning about how much greater than him God is, and he's so small, and God is outside of that boundary, right? It's affecting his sense of God. Says the Alter Rebbe, the very fact that that approach affects your sense of God means you have not yet appreciated that God is beyond the whole process. Because if you're saying that the Pythagorean theorem is less touchable than 1 + 1 = 2, that means you truly have not begun to approach what the Pythagorean theorem is. Right? You really have no idea, in other words. So the Alter Rebbe is saying the smart way of having no idea is to realize that this whole intellectual process and God do not intersect at all. Right? So the knowledge the Alter Rebbe is giving us is not a knowledge of God, really. All the Alter Rebbe is really telling us is that this whole human reality, which starts from intellect, and the divine reality are really, in fact, totally separate. Don't worry, later we're going to explain how they're totally bound together and absolutely one. Right? Remember, I mentioned this last week. Last week I said the entire purpose of putting him infinitely beyond Chachma is for 5 minutes later when we're going to explain how he's absolutely one with intellect. Right? This is the first step. It's counterintuitive. We'll explain. We'll explain why this is the way it must be. We'll explain. So this is just the first step. So don't be troubled, and let not your heart be troubled. Do not be discouraged. It's not all over. We don't have to give up so fast, right? But this is one point which is a true point that we have to understand, that God is not an intellectual idea.
So what you're saying is, don't worry, keep praying.
Keep what?
Yeah. Well, that's always good advice. Yeah.
Always good advice.
Just a quick note on what the Alter Rebbe says here to connect to my very strange opening to this lesson. The Alter Rebbe says that if you heard this idea, you would laugh. If you heard this idea, you would laugh. And really, not only does this tell us about the essence of comedy, it actually gives us a deeper appreciation of what the Alter Rebbe is saying here. Why? Because you only laugh you only laugh when someone says something, which is the context here, right? If you said that the idea is so deep I can't grasp it with my hands, you would laugh. If someone comes and tells you this idea is so deep I can't grasp it with my hands, that's a humorous statement. Why is it humorous? It's humorous because the very language itself, the very terms used, don't fit together. Right? In other words, the very language of touching and an idea are really totally unrelated, and it's because it's that element of surprise which makes comedy, right? That's what a punchline is. You're expecting, your mind is expecting certain ideas and certain words to bring something in their effect, right? Things are all going along in one direction. What's the punchline of the joke? The punchline of the joke is when all of a sudden you make a right turn, right? You go somewhere you weren't expecting at all, and that's funny, right? It's the ridiculousness of the juxtaposition of these two things, right? So Rabbi Yoel makes a very beautiful note here, and he says that if God and intellect were within the same realm, then saying I don't know God would enhance our avodas Hashem, like I was saying before, right? It would enhance our avodas Hashem. We would be humble. We would know how much He is above us, etc. It would, even though it's not knowledge, it would still give us meaning in the broader sense, right?
Right.
If God was unrelated to intellect, then we wouldn't get any meaning from saying that we don't understand God, like the Alter Rebbe is saying. However, if the two things were even superficially related, we wouldn't laugh, right? If there was still some connection, if there was still some superficial relationship between the two things, that doesn't cause laughter. What causes laughter? When two things are so ridiculous to put together, right, that there's no connection between these two things at all, right? That is what brings humor and what makes people laugh. Good evening, Shabbat Shalom. That's what brings humor and makes people laugh. So too, the Alter Rebbe is saying God and intellect are such a mismatch that if we actually appreciated how much of a mismatch we were, it's not just that it's not a useful statement, right? It's actually a ridiculous statement. It's beyond not useful. It doesn't approach not useful. It's actually a farce, right? It's a joke. It's laughable. So this is how the Alter Rebbe characterizes God's transcendence over wisdom. Let's read just one more line here. Va'afilu, bottom of page 954. Va'afilu hasagas sichlim shebe'olam hasayonim. Even the comprehension of intellects which are in the higher worlds, right? For example, of angels, right? Intellects, minds which are in higher realities. Va'afilu madregas chachme ilah, and even the higher wisdom. In other words, we are talking actually about God's emanated wisdom. God's wisdom itself, Hamachaya es kulam, which is the source and gives life to all of the worlds, spiritual and physical. Kedichsiv kulam b'chachma asisa. It is as the verse says, I have acted, chachma is to him like an action. In other words, this distance between God and understanding, as I've mentioned a couple of times now, is not just his distance from human understanding. Right? Because think about it. It fits perfectly with everything we've said tonight. Think about it, right? Angels, let's say an angel is twice as smart as the smartest human being, right? If God was merely a deeper idea, then an angel would have a better grasp of God, right? And the Chachma Ilah, which is the divine wisdom, would have the greatest grasp of God at all. But since wisdom is to him like an action, right? Since he is not within the realm of wisdom, it must be that no wisdom grasps him, not just human wisdom. In other words, it's not a matter of us not being smart, right? We are discussing an inherent quality of wisdom itself, right? Just like with touch, right? It's an inherent quality of touch itself that touch cannot touch the Pythagorean theorem. Right? It doesn't matter how sensitive your fingers are. It's not just that one person has really unsensitive fingers and one person has really sensitive fingers, so they can touch the idea. Right? Similarly, there is no distinguishing between human wisdom and the divine wisdom, even the wisdom of God. Right? The emanated divine wisdom, Chachma Ilah. God is above all wisdoms. He does not intersect with any wisdom, and if you even said that one wisdom could understand him better than another, it would actually be the same as saying that a human being doesn't understand God, right? If you were to say that an angel understands God better than a human being, you would be saying that a human being doesn't understand, but if their mind was a little bit better, then they would be able to understand. So it must be that not only can a human being not understand, but an angel can understand. Chachma Ilah, the highest emanated levels of wisdom in all the worlds, cannot understand. And that highest level of wisdom is the source for everything that is in our universe and the entire spiritual process of worlds which creates it. All the spiritual universes above us. So in other words, the absolute highest thing in our reality, from which our entire reality stems, is to him. It doesn't intersect with him at all. He's not within that gather, he's not within that realm, and we will continue and explain why this is important. We'll explain why we're discussing this more next week, God willing.